Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Dr. T. Vijay Kumar. I'm a professor of English at Osmania University, Hyderabad. This module is about Chinua Achebe and his novel Things Fall Apart. This is in the paper African and Caribbean Writing in English. You may recall that in one of the previous modules, we focused on the context of Things Fall Apart. In this module, we will focus more specifically on the text itself. Things Fall Apart is, to repeat, by Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian writer. This was Chinua Achebe's first novel, published in 1958. And Nigeria became independent in 1960, 2 years later. Things Fall Apart is easily the most read African text worldwide. This was a novel that deals with colonial encounter, which is the major theme of the novel. And the time of action is the late 19th century, around 1890s. And the place of action is an imaginary village called Umuofia, which is in eastern Nigeria. And the major ethnic group that this novel is about is the Igbo community. Igbos are one of the major ethnic groups in Nigeria, and the other being Yorubas in the west. As I said, the central theme of Things Fall Apart is colonial encounter. You may know that although British presence in Nigeria goes back to the 17th century, Britain took a firm control of Nigeria by the 1880s. And recognizing the dominance of the British presence in Nigeria, at the Berlin Conference in 1884, Nigeria was in a way given to Britain as a colony. So the British colonial period in Nigeria is from 1885 to 1960, when Nigeria became independent. Now, what is Things Fall Apart is all about? Things Fall Apart is about one man called Okonkwo. Okonkwo is a self-made man. He is the son of a father who is considered to be a failure because he died without any titles and he died without any wealth. And Okonkwo's father was considered to be a failure because he died without any titles, without any wealth. Okonkwo's father was also considered a weak and an effeminate man because he was afraid of blood and he was afraid of fighting and war. So despite such a handicap of an unsuccessful father and his legacy, Okonkwo rises to be one of the important leaders of his community. And he achieves this through sheer hard work and determination. But the story is also about the fall of Okonkwo. If the early part of the novel depicts the rise of Okonkwo from being the son of an unsuccessful father to be an important leader of his community, the later part of the novel shows the fall of Okonkwo. Okonkwo, who becomes an important leader of his community, perishes in his attempt to resist the wide-ranging changes introduced by the colonial rule. So in one sentence, Things Fall Apart is about the rise and fall of a self-made man called Okonkwo in Nigeria. The novel takes its title, Things Fall Apart, from a poem by W.B. Yeats titled The Second Coming. 4 lines from that poem of Yeats are quoted as the epigraph to the novel. And the lines run like this. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. So these are the lines which Achebe took from Yeats's poem titled The Second Coming. But Achebe does not take this title from Yeats's poem merely for the sake of novelty. There's a deep understanding in Achebe of Yeats's view of history. And Achebe seems to subscribe to that view of history which Yeats outlined in his non-fictional work called A Vision, published in 1925. In that book, Yeats describes his vision of history, his view of the rise and fall of civilizations. According to Yeats, all civilizations collapse as a result of two important factors. One, they collapse from within, and two, they collapse because of pressure from outside forces. According to Yeats, every civilization is an ordered structure created out of chaos. But all those elements which are left out do not just remain silent. They keep trying to barge in to the civilization. And every civilization is a hierarchical structure where certain values are privileged and other values are either marginalized or undervalued. So these undervalued or marginalized values form the cracks in the structure called civilization. These are the internal cracks. So when the internal cracks combine with the external forces, civilizations collapse. So the collapse of civilizations is inevitable, natural, and a part of the evolutionary process. And according to Yeats, all civilizations collapse because of a combination of internal weaknesses as well as external pressures. Achebe, in a way, seems to subscribe to this view of history and this view of the rise and fall of civilizations. And that is the reason why Achebe borrows this line from Yeats's poem, The Second Coming. So, the title Things Fall Apart, taken from Yeats's The Second Coming, is taken not merely because Achebe likes that poem. It is because Achebe seems to agree with Yeats's view of history. Now, the characters in Things Fall Apart. As I said, the novel revolves around the central character of Okonkwo. Okonkwo is a wrestler, he's a warrior, and he becomes an important man in his community. Okonkwo's father is another character. Important character because the relation between father and son is an important theme in the novel. Okonkwo's father, Unoka, was considered a womanly person. That is, an effeminate person because he loved womanly things like music and he did not like manly things like war. The third character is Okonkwo's own son, Noe. Noe is very unlike Okonkwo and more like his grandfather, Unoka. Because Noe too likes music and Noe too likes stories, which Okonkwo considers to be very womanly features. Then we have a son-like character, Ikemefuna. Ikemefuna is a young boy who is given to Okonkwo. Okonkwo is the guardian of Ikemefuna. And in the course of the novel, Ikemefuna is sacrificed because Ikemefuna was actually given to this community as a kind of penalty. And Ikemefuna is a kind of son that Okonkwo would have liked. And then Okonkwo's daughter, Ezinma, is actually Okonkwo's most favorite child among his children. Because Ezinma has all the qualities that Okonkwo admires. And yet, Okonkwo cannot show his affection towards Ezinma because, in his view, showing affection is a very womanly quality. So we have the real son Noe and the son-like character Ikemefuna and daughter Ezinma, whom very often Okonkwo feels Ezinma should have been a boy. So there are these sons and son-like characters around Okonkwo. And then two other characters which are important in the novel are Okonkwo's best friend, Oberika. Oberika is a very wise man. Oberika is a man whom Okonkwo admires. But Oberika, in a way, is a kind of a counterfoil to Okonkwo, because Okonkwo is a man of action, whereas Oberika is a man of thought. Then there is a character called Uchendu, who is the maternal uncle of Okonkwo. And it is Uchendu who actually exposes the faulty and the partial understanding of Okonkwo of the values of his culture. So these are the few characters. There are several others, but these are the few important characters in this novel, Things Fall Apart. As far as the plot of the novel is concerned, the novel begins with Okonkwo rising to be one of the important leaders of his community. Then the important event of the killing of Ikemefuna, which creates a kind of a rift between Okonkwo and his son Noe. Because for Noe, Ikemefuna is almost like a hero, and Ikemefuna is a kind of a role model for Noe. And when, in spite of the advice that Okonkwo should not have any role to play in the killing of Ikemefuna, Okonkwo in fact not only participates in the killing of Ikemefuna, but in fact Ikemefuna is killed by in his own hands. And this creates a major rift between Okonkwo and his son Noe, and it creates a kind of gulf between the father and the son. Then Okonkwo commits a female crime, which is, he accidentally kills a fellow clan's, a young man from his own clan, because Okonkwo is very clumsy with guns, and in one of the festivities, his gun goes off accidentally and kills someone from his own clan. And because this killing was unintentional, it is considered to be a female crime. But Okonkwo has to pay a price for that female crime. And that is, Okonkwo has to spend 7 years in exile outside the village of Umuofia. So during Okonkwo's absence for 7 years outside Umuofia, the white man enters Umuofia with a new religion, with a new economy, and a new administrative setup. Another African writer, Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya, once described the holy trinity of colonialism as the Bible, the coin, and the gun. So during Okonkwo's absence from Umuofia, the white man establishes his presence in Umuofia. So when Okonkwo comes back to Umuofia after 7 years in exile, he finds the entire society completely changed. And he tries to regain his position in the society, and he participates in the demolition of a church which has been set up in Umuofia. Of course, the church is razed to the ground because the church crosses its bounds and tries to interfere in the traditional systems of Umuofia. And when the church is demolished, the white man arrives and arrests the village leaders, including Okonkwo. And these leaders are taken to prison, and they are humiliated, by shaving their heads and so on. And they are released after the entire village pays a fine for the crime committed by their village elders. When Okonkwo and the other village elders are released by the white man, they come back to Umuofia and they have a meeting to decide the next course of action. And Okonkwo is strongly in favor of waging a war against the white man, because he feels that this is an opportunity for him to regain his lost position in the community. And while this meeting is going on, a messenger of the white man arrives to stop this meeting from taking place. In a fit of anger, Okonkwo gets up and beheads this messenger with his machete. And Okonkwo expects his entire community, the entire village, to appreciate his action. He expects them to praise his bravery. But unfortunately, the village is divided now. People start asking, why did he do it? And when Okonkwo realizes that the entire village is no longer with him and no longer speaks in one voice, Okonkwo is disheartened. And he knows very well what is the consequence of killing a white man's messenger. So instead of being arrested and tried by the white man, Okonkwo kills himself. He commits suicide by hanging himself from a tree in the village center. And ironically, the same village for which Okonkwo fought, nobody from that village can touch his body, because anybody who commits suicide is considered to be an abomination among these villagers. So his body keeps hanging from the tree, and ironically, it is the same white man who comes with his messengers, and he has to bring down the body. So this is the story of a man who tries to resist change, who tries to resist colonialism, who tries to resist the alien values introduced by the white man and pays the price for it. It is also the story of a man who lost the support of his village, and a man who, in a way, kills himself because he's totally disheartened. So this is the plot, broadly, of Things Fall Apart. The structure of the novel. Things Fall Apart has 25 chapters. The 25 chapters are divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is the longest, with 13 chapters. Part 2 and Part 3 have 6 chapters each. In a way, the structure of the novel is defined by Yeats's poem itself. If you read Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, and not just the 4 lines that are used as an epigraph, to the novel, but also the 2 lines which follow those 4 lines, you will understand the structure of the novel. Because the 2 lines which are not quoted in the epigraph, but which follow the 4 lines, read something like this. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. I'll read that again. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. If you understand these 2 lines, you would understand the structure of the novel. Because Part 1, which is, as I said, is the longest, actually is a description of the ceremony of innocence. And Part 2 describes how a blood tide is loosed upon this village. And the 3rd part describes things falling apart. So the structure of the novel is something like this. Part 1 is focused on setting. That is, the ethnographic details whereby Okonkwo and his village Umuofia are described as an organic village, as a self-contained village, and a village that is independent in itself. Part 2 focuses more on community issues, because in entire part 2, Okonkwo is in the background. And part 2 also is devoted to the 7 years of Okonkwo's life in exile. Part 3 comes back to Umuofia, and the setting is again Umuofia, but a Umuofia which is no longer the same, because part 3 describes how the intrusion of the white man has completely changed the village and its values. So, while part 1 establishes the validity of the Nigerian Igbo community, part 2 introduces the changes that are being brought by the white man, and part 3 describes how things fall apart. The structure of the novel shows also the mastery of Achebe in writing this novel, because the simplicity of the novel is very misleading. Achebe is a very careful craftsman. The two important events in the novel, one is Ikemefuna's killing. Ikemefuna's killing has consequences which actually bring us to the end of the novel, because one of the grudges of Okonkwo against the white man is that it has deprived him of his son, because Noe converts to Christianity. Abandoning his own religion, he joins the church. So this is a grudge that Okonkwo nurses against the white man. But the rift, the gulf between Noe and Okonkwo actually begins with the killing of Ikemefuna. And that event takes place in chapter 7. And chapter 7, if you look at part 1 consists of 13 chapters. So therefore chapter 7 is bang in the middle of the 13 chapters, with 6 chapters on this side and 6 chapters on that, with 7th chapter as the middle. Similarly, the second important event in the novel takes place in chapter 13. Again, chapter 13, if you look at the overall novel, is again in the very middle of the entire 25 chapters. Because chapter 13 has 12 chapters on one side and the remaining 12 on the other, and 13 comes in the middle of 25 chapters. And the important event that takes place in chapter 13 is the accidental killing of a clansman by Okonkwo. Because of this female crime, Okonkwo is forced to live in exile for 7 years. So the two important events in the novel take place at crucial times, and Achebe very carefully orchestrates the entire action into those crucial chapter 7 and chapter 13. So this is the overall structure of the novel, with 25 chapters divided into 3 parts. Some of the major themes of the novel. If you look at the major themes of the novel, of course the major theme is the theme of colonial encounter. The encounter between indigenous society and the alien culture brought by the white man. But there are also other themes in the novel. One of the important themes in the novel is the father-son relationship. As I said earlier, there are fathers and sons in the novel. There is Unoka, the unsuccessful father, and one of the things which Okonkwo wants to achieve throughout his life is that he wants to be completely unlike his father. In fact, one of the driving motivations of Okonkwo in his entire life is that he should not be considered someone like his father. But ironically, his own son, Noe, deserts him. And the father-son relationship is complicated by the sons that Okonkwo never had and wished that he had. like Ikemefuna and like Ezinma. So the father-son relationship is very important in a culture like the Igbos or the African cultures. Because the African cultures, in many African cultures, there is a strong belief that the past is connected to the present and the present to the future. So a broken family, that is a broken chain between a father and a son, represents the break in that link, in that chain. So Unoka, Okonkwo's father, died of a swelling of his body, and because he died of a mysterious disease, he is not given a decent burial. And not receiving a decent burial would mean that he cannot join the ancestors, that he just remains a spirit. So there is already a kind of a break between Okonkwo and his father. And Okonkwo, who all his life tried to be completely the opposite of his father, actually dies again like his father. Because Okonkwo too is not given a decent burial because he commits suicide, which is considered to be a great sin among these people. So the father-son relationship is a very important theme in the novel. Another important theme is the theme of masculinity and femininity, or the male and the female principles. Okonkwo's life, we are told, is motivated by two fears. One is the fear of being considered womanly and the fear of failure. And Okonkwo tries to be kind of hyper masculine. He tries to represent masculinity in its essence. And therefore, he banishes from his life everything which he considers womanly. Like, for example, stories, like, for example, music, like, for example, showing affection. All these things Okonkwo considers to be womanly qualities. And he never shows his love, affection for his daughter Ezinma, or for that matter towards anyone, because he feels that showing affection is considered a sign of weakness. And Okonkwo wants to succeed at any cost. So the fear of failure and the fear of being considered womanly are the two motivations in Okonkwo's life. But ironically, in the novel, we are told again and again that Okonkwo comes into conflict with this female principle. Because by killing a clansman accidentally, Okonkwo commits a female crime. And during his exile, Okonkwo has to live in his maternal uncle's house. And it is during that exile, his uncle tells him the importance of mother, which of course Okonkwo never understood. Okonkwo also does not understand that in this culture, which he considers to be a very manly culture, the highest god is the goddess of earth, which is again a woman. So Okonkwo's understanding, or rather his misunderstanding of the female principle, creates one of the major conflicts in his life. The third important theme in this novel is the theme of tradition and modernity, or tradition and change. Okonkwo resists change, and Okonkwo tries to retain what he understands as the tradition of his village. But the tradition is not a static tradition, and Okonkwo's understanding of tradition is very, very weak and kind of incomplete. Oberika is one who constantly tells him that tradition is something which is constantly evolving. But Okonkwo resists change, and in that process, of course, this is a change that is brought by an outside force. And this is a change which Okonkwo tries to resist and perishes in that attempt. So, the father-son relationship and the masculinity and femininity principle, the conflict between success and failure, what is considered success and what is considered failure, and the conflict between tradition and change are some of the major themes in this novel. Achebe's narrative technique in the novel is something that we must pay attention to. Although Achebe uses the novel as a genre, and novel traditionally associated with Western culture, and although Achebe uses the English language, again a colonial language, Achebe uses both the novel as a genre and the English language as a medium of expression, but he tries to bring in features of oral narrative into this written text. Some of the features of orality that you can observe in the novel are, for example, Achebe's use of proverbs and how proverbs are explained as if there is an audience who is sitting right in front of the writer, asking him, what does it mean? And the second feature of orality is the kind of offhand, casual references to history. For example, at the very beginning of the novel, we are told that the battle or the wrestling match between Okonkwo and Amelinze the cat is the fiercest battle from the beginning of this community. So this kind of an offhand reference to the origins of the society is another feature of orality. Now, orality or oral literatures, oral traditions also have narratives where you have stories within stories. In oral narratives, no single story is ever complete because there are stories within stories. And most of these stories are almost independent. They are self-contained. And again, in Things Fall Apart, you have several chapters, for example, chapter number 2, chapter number 1, which can be actually removed from or detached from the rest of the novel, and they can stand themselves as stories complete in themselves. So these self-contained stories is another feature of oral narratives. And then another feature of oral narratives is this kind of foreboding, that is, indicating or suggesting events even before they happen. For example, the first reference to Ikemefuna in the novel is, he's called the doomed lad. Now, this is the first time we are introduced to the character of Ikemefuna, and already Achebe uses this adjective, doomed. Similarly, he describes the story of Ikemefuna as the sad story. At this point of time, we do not know why his story is considered sad or why Ikemefuna is called doomed. But right at the very beginning, there are words, there are events which have a kind of a foreboding effect. One of the features of orality which is very prominent in this novel are the use of proverbs. And if you look at the overall structure of the novel, the proverbs are very recurrent in part 1 and they are almost absent in part 3. And the presence or absence of proverbs is not accidental, because Achebe is using proverbs as an indicator of the collective value of a society. That is, proverbs are possible only when a society shares or a society has certain common values. And in the third part, which is dominated by the white man, there are no proverbs at all. Or in fact, very few proverbs in the last part of the novel. So using proverbs as a kind of a collective wisdom, the distilled wisdom of generations, is an important factor and an important feature of orality in the novel. Things Fall Apart is often read as a tragedy. It is, of course, a tragedy of Okonkwo as an individual. And when you read Things Fall Apart as the tragedy of an individual, you tend to look at this novel almost like a Greek tragedy, where you have a noble character, a heroic character, who, in a way, perishes, who falls because of a fatal flaw. And in this case, Okonkwo's fatal flaw is his rigidity and his lack of understanding of the core values of his culture. And Things Fall Apart, however, is not just the tragedy of one individual. It is also a societal tragedy, a tragedy that is catalyzed by the arrival of the white man and the imposition of alien values and alien culture. But at the same time, it is a societal tragedy because Okonkwo's own community has its own internal weaknesses. These are, for example, superstitions like not accepting twins or considering twins to be a huge crime, or considering twins as an abomination, or human sacrifices. But the most important weakness of Umuofia as a community is their lack of foresight, their inability to think about future in conceptual frames. They are people who live only in the present. They are unable to foresee into the future. This turns out to be one of the failures of this community. So it is both an individual tragedy as well as the tragedy of a community. But the tragedy of the community is aggravated by the sudden interruption of their evolutionary process by the intrusion of the alien rule. And this brings us back to the title of the novel, where Achebe, in a way, subscribes to Yeats's view of the fall of civilizations as the result of a coalition between internal weaknesses and the external pressures. So, in a way, the Umuofia community falls because of both its own internal weaknesses as well as the pressure exerted by the alien rule. To conclude, Things Fall Apart, published in 1958, is a classic study of colonial encounter. Achebe offers a sympathetic, critical insider's view of Nigerian society in general and of Umuofia community in particular. Through this novel, Achebe seeks to counter the artificial and unjust representation of Africa in colonial discourse. As you would recall, that there is a long and lasting tradition of representing Africa in European writing going back to the 16th century. And through this novel, Achebe seeks to counter that image of Africa, that myth of Africa, which is manufactured and perpetuated in colonial discourse. More particularly, by treating Africa as a subject and not as an object, Achebe seeks to provide an alternative frame of reference which is missing, according to him, in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So Things Fall Apart is a valuable novel in itself. But the larger significance of Things Fall Apart as a novel can be understood only by reading it in the broader context of how Africa has been represented in European writing for centuries. And we can read Things Fall Apart as an individual text, but also as a text which lays the foundation for Africa's self-representation. Things Fall Apart is considered to be a classic, not only because of the mastery of the writer, but also because what it has been able to contribute to African literature in general.